Thanks, Graham. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So yes, my name is Evan. I'm an American living in Paris. I'm an artist. And let's see if the slides are working here. I thought I'd start today by talking a bit about some of my projects, showing the work that I do within the context of this overlap between free culture and popular culture, the overlap between viral media or contagious media and the arts, and the intersection of graffiti and technology. And so I make different projects that inhabit all these spaces, but the one thing that I'm kind of always interested in is this sort of sweet spot between open source or free culture and popular culture, and my interest in sort of having that little orange zone in the middle get bigger over time. And I do that by dealing with the Bored at Work network. And the Bored at Work network this is a term coined by a friend and mentor of mine named Jonah Peretti, and it just deals with the fact that there's this audience of people sitting in their offices from 9 to 5 every day and bored as hell, right? And this audience to me is as interesting or perhaps more interesting than the audience of people that might go view art in the gallery. And so when I'm making projects, I'm really trying to get both of these two communities sort of looking at the same work, enjoying the same projects, and laughing at the same jokes. And so when I'm talking about art, I'm not really talking about the art that looks like this. I'm thinking more about the creative content that happens on the web that might look like this. I'm interested in art that's not boring. I'm also interested in activism, but I'm not interested in people holding angry signs. I'm interested in a kind of activism that's fun, that's participatory, and that people want to take part in rather than walk away from when they see people on the streets. And so just to jump right into it, I thought I'd start by showing a project that I did back when I was in graduate school. This isn't necessarily my best work, but it's one that I kind of think back to when I'm making work now. This was 2004, and I was in New York at the time when the Republican National Convention was going on. A lot of artists were making work related to the Bush administration. And so I was taking a break from my thesis project to trying to make just a weekend project, something I could just do in a weekend. And so what I did is I got these postal labels that you can get to mail packages for free at the US Post Office, sent them through a printer, and just added this one sentence: the US Postal Service does not acknowledge the authority of the Bush administration. And so it's a very small intervention, right? An intervention that I was thinking people might not even notice as they fill these out at the post office and mail them across the country. So then, of course, the project was getting them back into the post office for people to use either knowingly or unknowingly. Is there audio on the laptop also? Thanks.
I want to talk to you. My name is Quanda, but they call me Lady Q. I'm down with the Dream Team, Rudy and Snake, and I was born and raised in the streets of LA.
So it was a very simple intervention, right? It was taking this design and just adding these one little sentence here, right? And this, for me, it got home a couple points. Like, one was making content that was fun, that could happen in public space, but that could also have a life on the web. But it was also about a hack, right? It was also one of the first times that I started thinking about public space projects the way that computer hackers think about software systems, and how you can hack these systems that happen in real space the way that hackers and tinkers think about hacking digital spaces. And the second thing it brought me to was this Eric Raymond quote, "Lazy like a fox," where he was describing Linus Torvald of Linux fame, right? And the idea is just that there's a brilliance in trying to get across the maximum impact with the least amount of effort. This was a project that I conceived, documented, and uploaded to the web all in one weekend, and I had just as much feedback on that project than I did from working on my thesis project that took 2 years. And so this is something I try to keep in my mind as I'm making new work. And I try to keep it in mind when I'm thinking about graffiti as well. Like, a lot of people, when they think of graffiti, they think of something like this. They think of something very colorful, very technical, perhaps very beautiful, perhaps very ugly. But at the high end, the top of graffiti, a lot of people think about these beautiful murals, which I find to be boring as hell and have nothing to do with what really interests me in making work in the streets. This is one of my favorite pieces of graffiti of all time. So what we're looking at here is an advertisement in the New York subway system. And so every week they layer up these advertisements on top of each other. And someone came along and just ripped off the bottom line of this Harry Potter ad to reveal an advertisement from Hot 97. And just that simple act of removal, just that 2-second swipe of the hand, completely changed someone's walk to work. And so when I'm thinking about graffiti and what I like about graffiti, I'm not interested in how big and beautiful the letter forms are. I'm interested in where they were put up and what systems they're hacking, as is in this example. So with that in mind, I thought I'd show some of my projects and how these ideas kind of translate into my work. I spend a lot of time in airports and dealing with going through customs and sitting on airplanes and waiting in lines. And so I was trying to think of how I could take this lazy like a fox mentality and translate it to transforming this, this act of going to the airport all the time. So I did a series of projects making art in airports. The first one I did was called Sky Mall Liberation. Sky Mall is the shopping catalog you get on US flights where you can flip through it and buy like iPod dispensers with toilet paper rolls and crazy stuff like this. And so I'd take the magazine out and I would rip out all the faces and then I'd compose sort of data visualization demographic studies on my tray table in front of me. So this is, I think this is men versus women in the catalog. This is non-white people versus white people in the catalog. And so it was just a way of making data visualizations that I could spend an hour and a half of my flight doing. Another art and airport project I was working on back in 2006 is called TSA Communication. And the idea for this one is simple. It's you have some thoughts about how you feel about security in the US or anywhere as you're traveling. You cut that idea into a metal plate, you put it into your carry-on bag, you send it through the X-ray machine, and then it's sort of this long process from getting an idea from your head into their heads. So the original concept was something like this. And so the actual plates look like this. This is one, I have a series of these now that I can choose from when I travel. And I also started documenting this process, and this was just part of my daily routine as I traveled now. I'd wake up, I'd head to the airport, I'd pick out what message I wanted to put in my backpack. This was in the Bangkok airport where they noticed it. And so it's a way of transforming this sort of your forced role of being a passive participant in this theater of security into a more active role. So that was TSA Communication. A last one in this series of art and airports, this is one called How to Keep Motherfuckers from Putting Their Seats Back. And this is a very simple project that involves an industrial strength zip tie. You have to have a willing sort of passenger to the seat next to you, but this does work. So again, maximum impact, minimum effort. And so I really like this idea of small, quick hacks. And I'm also a tool maker, so I like this idea of empowering tools and thinking that a zip tie could be an empowering technology. And through this series, I like this idea of art being able to transform our daily surroundings, right? So as I was doing these projects, especially the TSA Communication, it transformed me waking up in the morning and dreading these long lines and dreading the security process and these long flights. And instead, I'm waking up and I'm nervous and I'm thinking and I'm active and I'm trying to think, how am I going to get the right shot? How am I going to get through that? What's my backup plan? And so my experience with going through security was completely transformed. And so this is also something I try to think about as I'm moving forward in my own art practice, but also in my teaching. I teach at Parsons School of Design. Originally, I was teaching in New York. Now I'm in Paris. I'm teaching at their branch in Paris. And I've found from these are primarily originally graduate students, and now I teach undergraduate students in this area, art programs. And one thing I've found is that students get very wrapped up in worrying about what their peers in the classroom think. They're worried about what their critics think, what their teachers think, and they're quick to forget that there's a lot of people outside the walls of the classroom. And so I teach a series of 2 classes where I try to give them an opportunity to forget about critiques in the classroom and start thinking about everyone else that's just as willing to give them feedback, for better or for worse. And so for 3 hours a week, I try to give my students a chance to experiment with embracing these audiences and start looking at analytics and looking at how many people are following them and how many YouTube views they have, and get across this idea by embracing these networks. As artists, we have a better chance of influencing greater culture with our ideas. And so the 2 classes I teach, one was originally called Internet Famous. Now I call it Viral Media for Artists. And the idea is simple for this class is that your grade is linked to how popular you are online. So at the end of the semester, they show me how many YouTube views they've gotten. They show me how many top 20 blogs they've made publications on, how many digs they've had. All these things, they can make a case for what their grade should be, and it's pretty easy to tally up what that turns into. The other class I teach, I used to call it Geek Graffiti. Now I'm calling it Urban Hacking. And the idea for this one is what I was talking about before. It's introducing art and design students to start looking at the city in a different way and looking at the city like hackers, looking for systems that repeat, looking for places that they can exploit to change the meaning of. So just to quickly show some projects that have come out of these classes, this is a master class I taught in Russia where a group of students was looking at this as a system and transformed it into a ticking time bomb. One of my students in New York was dealing with hacking advertising, and they came up with these stickers that you could print, and they were cold sores that you could add to advertising. This semester, a student was interested in dealing with escalators as communication devices, and they came up with this. One of my favorite projects that came out of a recent series of master classes I taught in Yekaterinburg in Russia was this one called The Mute. And it was dealing with the fact that on the streets of Yekaterinburg, it was very popular to record advertisements and just blast them with a megaphone on the street. So this student was dealing with that as a system.
Этого ждал весь город. Это событие глобального масштаба. Добро пожаловать в новую торговую галерею в самом центре города. Красный леопард. Это искушение стильным интерьером и ярким шопингом. Десятки бутиков, только на актуальные бренды, эксклюзивные модели одежды, обуви, аксессуары.
I spend a lot of time dealing with technology, and I do projects that involve motion tracking and digital projectors and computers and writing code. And so I love a project like this that with a pillow we stole from my hotel room and a broom handle we bought for the equivalent of like £1, he was able to come up with a project that again worked both in the streets and it worked in documentation on the web. And so when I'm talking with students, I'm talking a lot about statistics and audience and who's looking at our projects. Because when we have an audience, we have influence. And so I think of the Oprah model of this a lot, right? Like everyone knows Oprah Winfrey, right? Oprah can hold up a book and everybody in the United States reads it, right? And so this is like severe cultural influence that she has. And this is starting to happen more and more in the arts. This is a project by a friend of mine, a colleague named Charlie Todd. He runs a group called Improv Everywhere. This one is called The High Five. And I like Charlie's work a lot. I like his documentation a lot. I like the way he deals with the web. I like the fact that he's developed a huge, huge audience. And Charlie is someone who's a little bit like me in the sense that it's just someone making stuff with potentially zero budget, right? Just a webcam or a YouTube account and a video camera. And so even though we're not as big as Oprah yet, I like this idea that while Oprah's averaging 7 million views per episode, Charlie's averaging 1.3 million views per YouTube video he uploads. This isn't necessarily a one-to-one comparison, but the fact that we as individual makers of stuff with no budget and no corporate infrastructure behind us, the fact that we're getting closer and closer to having the influence of Oprah is exciting to me as an artist. And so because of that, I spend very little time putting paint to canvas, and I spend much more time uploading and hitting publish buttons. And I look less towards traditional art creation models and look more towards open source production models for when I'm making work. I really like the release early and often dictum from Linus Torvalds. I tried to spice that up just a little bit to release early, often, and with rap music, because I am interested in my work spreading outside of just the tech scene and outside of just the art scene. and create work that talks to more people but is still spreading this open source idea. And I also like this idea of releasing early and often too, because it speaks to the fact that art is also research, right? I don't like thinking of art as something that we finish and polish in a room and then bring to the gallery and put on the wall and it's done. I like the idea that all this is part of an ongoing process and it's never done, so you might as well just push it out there. So one example from my own work of a project that is dealing with this overlap between hip-hop and open source is a video I made for Jay-Z. Jay-Z was donating a song to the Red charity, and long story short, got in touch with me to make a treatment for the song he wanted to donate. And the lyrics of the song were about Brooklyn, so the concept I pitched him was using an old project I'd made back in grad school and spicing this up since the time frame was very short. It was about a 3-day turnaround time. But the idea was to spell out, to create imagery based in type using the letters from the song. So I'll just show a couple seconds of this. This is called typographic illustration.
I father, I Brooklyn Dodger them, I jack, I rob, I sin, oh man, I'm Jackie Robinson, except when I run base, I dodge the pen, lucky me, luckily they didn't get me, now when I bring the nets, I'm the Black Branch Ricky, from Brooklyn corners, burning branches are sticky, spread love, Biggie, Brooklyn, hippie, I pity, the fool with jewels like Mr. T, with no history in my barrel, they borrow, with no intentions of returning tomorrow. The sun don't come out for many, like Annie, half orphan. Mama never had an abortion, Papa sorta did. Still I managed to live. I go hard, I owe it all to the crib. Now please tell me, what the fuck's harder than this?
So the video goes on, and although I was extremely excited to be working with Jay-Z, who's a hero of mine, Kanye West did the beat, another hero of mine, and I liked the way the video turned out, but the thing I was the most excited about was this last frame of the video. This is the last 3 seconds. It ends with this single slide that just says source code available at, and then a link to download code from my site. And I had to have a back and forth a little bit with the people in Jay-Z's camp about having a URL that links to my website at the end of a Jay-Z video. But in the end, they let this go, and the reason this was exciting to me was because then close to 2 million people that were coming to see a Jay-Z video are now asking, what is this source code thing? What is this? Why is this important? Why is this exciting? Why should I care? And this idea of getting people that maybe haven't heard of source code again, getting this idea infused into other markets is something that I'm really interested in. And this goes through a lot of my work, of getting different communities collaborating on projects together. And just one more note on Jay-Z, because I just finished his Decoded book, and one thing he talks about in the book is that he likes to hear his music playing out of car windows. He doesn't want to just have his music show up on music nerd blogs on the web. He wants, I want to hear my music, I want my music to play where people live. And I think this is a good sort of parallel to the way I think about my art. I don't want my art just to show up in museums. I don't want the technology I'm making just to show up on TechCrunch. I want this to filter out even off the web and get into the minds of a general population. So another project surrounding open source and popular music was one I did called White Glove Tracking. Similar sort of pop culture, open source overlap, but also involve crowdsourcing, which I know a lot of us are familiar with now. Those of you who aren't, the basic idea is like Mechanical Turk. Instead of writing complicated algorithms to solve problems, there's certain problems that can be easier to solve by just asking anonymous people on the web to make very small, to help you with small goals. And so the problem I wanted to solve was tracking Michael Jackson's White Glove in his kind of epic first performance of Billie Jean, where he first did the moonwalk on television, kind of blew my mind as a child. And so the application, online app I made, takes a single frame from the video and just tells the user, click and drag a box around the glove. So you click and drag a box, you hit upload, and then it's dealing with the board at work network, not just as an audience now, but as a collaborator. Since there's a lot of people I know, I've talked to even friends who are like, I clicked on gloves for 4 hours today. And so I love hearing that. I love wasting company time with my work. And so that turned into not just an end result in terms of something to look at, it turned into data. So it turned the entire motion of the white glove. I had the frame number, XY coordinates, width and height for every frame. I think I had 13 sets of data per frame that was averaged down to something that was pretty close approximation of where the glove is. And then the next step was then taking that data and releasing that as an open data set for other people to make work with. And so it was open on the data collection end, and then it was also open on the data visualization end. And that my hand was just in the middle to sort of facilitate that handoff. And I'll just show a second of what the resulting videos from users and friends looked like. So this is white glove tracking. This first one is called Giant Glove by Tim Naffman. This next one's by Zach Lieberman, and the glove is always centered. So the video's online if you want to see the whole thing. But one thing, this was the first time I experimented with open data. And so I've dealt a lot with open source software, but this is the first time I was really getting interested in open data. And this is something I'm still dealing with now with graffiti markup language, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But at the time I was making white glove tracking, I was at an art nonprofit in New York called iBeam that deals with art and technology. And I was also co-founding this other organization with a friend and collaborator named James Powderly called Graffiti Research Lab. And the idea of Graffiti Research Lab was that we were going to make tools for graffiti writers and activists and pranksters and people interested in working outside, but we were going to make them all open source, all with how-to guides, all with source code downloads. And so the first project we made was called LED Throwies. This is the simplest DIY electronics project someone can make. It just involves taking an LED, a magnet, and a battery and wrapping them in tape. And so we were brainstorming, like, what's the simplest, cheapest way we can embed electronics into the city? So you can get them very cheaply. We show where we can buy them for as cheap as possible. We show how to make them, which is a little bit ridiculous since it's very easy, but then we get together in mass and have these events like this where we either throw them at stuff or spell words. The biggest kind of software project we've released was one called Laser Tag. This is software designed for graffiti writers. It's open source. You can download it for free, modify it. And the basic idea is that it's a free speech tool using free software. And you can just hand a graffiti writer a laser pointer, and the computing and the technology is kind of invisible. And all they have to do is just point it at the building and write their name. And so this has been used by graffiti writers. It's been used by activists. And it's one of these projects that started to hit what I was talking about in the beginning, which is that these two audiences were looking at this project and enjoying something that they maybe not have common ground on. The Museum of Modern Art put this in their permanent collection. On YouTube, it's got close to 2 million views now. And there's graffiti writers around the world downloading this and using it. And so it was through the work that James and I were doing with GRL that I started really thinking more about this formula of combining open source projects with viral media or contagious media, and how this can be something that pushes along not just graffiti, not just public space work, but is also a way to push forward general ideals and free culture and open source. And through that kind of thinking, GRL is still around, but sort of is transformed more into FAT, which is the Free Art and Technology Lab, which shares a lot of the same ideas and goals as GRL, but doesn't have the requirement of always having to be public space work. So FAT's basically a group of friends that are connected online and working via the web. We have a blog, we work in IRC, we have a sort of internal email list that we collaborate on. One of the best things about us is that we have no money. We don't seek money. And this is often a bad thing for organizations, but for us, it means that we don't have any rules. It means that we don't have any bosses. Everyone in the crew is admin privileges to everything, so we don't have to have any meetings about anything because things just happen, and if you don't like it, you can log in as admin and change it. And so it's sort of a group based on respectful anarchy among friends, and it's meant to be a place where we can collaborate on projects that push forward free culture. And we have certain things in common, and one of the things I've started to think about when I think about fat and even my own work is this Tootsie Pop theory, that there's something in the center that might be very political, that might have a lot to do with our feelings about copyright that are very specific, but we wrap this in fun, and in the end, we're trying to make fun projects that we like and that people want to look at. So I also think of like a Volvo as a metaphor for Linux and for free culture and for what we're doing, and how a Volvo is a car that gets you where you're going. It's going to start all the time. It's going to run forever, but the kids are not going to want to show up at the club in a Volvo, right? And so fat is kind of like putting really fancy rims on the Volvo, right? We're not going to be involved in tinkering with the engine, just like we're not going to be the people that are going to be helping to program the Linux kernel or write the next print driver, video codecs. But our kind of role is more of like free culture marketers, like how to get this out, how to get at people looking at this work. And so to just show some projects that we've done sort of as a crew, last year we met in Berlin for Transmediale, which is an art and technology festival, and we pitched to Transmediale that we wanted to just come as a group and make projects under the banner of Fuck Google, and so that was the theme we chose. And one of the projects we did was surrounding the Google streetcar. So on the left is a real Google streetcar spotted in Berlin, and on the right is a car that we rented for 2 days, a roof rack that we bought on eBay for 15 euros, and a contraption made out of cardboard tubes and duct tape on top that looks strikingly similar to the Google Mobile. And so the idea was to make a how-to guide for how to make your own Google streetcar so that you could go out in the city and brainstorm things that Google might not really want to find itself doing publicly. So this is our contraption that actually has no camera in top. And so then we just were thinking of like skits, like this is the Hit the Biker skit. And we're uploading these to YouTube and being like, look at what assholes Google is. This is the Getting Lost skit. We parked for a long time in front of the Chinese embassy. We tried to break down in like the busiest traffic circles. This was the drinking and driving skit. I don't know if they really have carjackings in Berlin, but there were enough Americans in the group that we wanted to stage a carjacking. This is the obligatory fail skit. So we all had different reasons in the group for why we wanted to do this. None of us are like Google vegetarians. We all drift and use Google products as we see fit and make our own decisions about that. But the general idea is to get people questioning Google and, and question like, are they really as unevil as they claim to be? Or are there reasons that we should be worried about uploading all of our content to their servers? But when we release work as Fat, or when I'm releasing work on my own, what I'm hoping to wake up to in the morning is this, right? I self-admittedly am hitting refresh on my analytics account, trying to see if Google is tracking just how much we are debranding them, hopefully. And so in this case, we had, 95,000 views that day. And to us, this means that we're getting this radio play that Jay-Z is talking about, right? We're getting interest in this project outside of our specific communities. And in this case, it was getting off the web. There was articles in Forbes. There was articles in The Guardian. So as people were drinking their morning coffee, these questions surrounding Google were hopefully coming up. And these traffic spikes are things that I sort of strive for in my work, and in collaborative projects I'm doing a lot as a way to push forward some of these ideas. And one of them we were looking for a spike in as well is this project called iWriter. This is another collaborative project I was on with it was a team of 6. This is James Powderly, myself, Theo Watson, Zach Lieberman, Chris Segru, and Tempt One, who are involved in the original version of this. There's now a lot more people involved in this project. But the original idea for this project was more of a personal itch project where we met with Tempt One, who's an activist and an artist and a graffiti writer from Los Angeles. Tempt was diagnosed with ALS 7 years ago, so now he's completely paralyzed and has just eye movement. And so the original impetus for the project was making software and a DIY system that would allow him to write graffiti again. And so this was footage from that kind of version 1.0 that was using a commercially available camera you could buy that was bundled with a video game unit, glasses, and simple electronics. The original version we were trying to make without even any soldering, so this could be reproduced very easily and connected to a sort of standard consumer-grade laptop. And the idea was to try to come up with a system that hopefully in the future could sort of replace these medically assistive computing devices that when you look under the hood are nothing more than a Windows operating system and some webcams, but they have a price tag of $20,000 or $30,000. And so as you can see, it allows Tempt to write letters that he could then form with words, add colors, drop shadow, 3D, all the thing any sort of graffiti writer would want. These were some of the first tags that he made using that first system of the software. On the left, you can see an image from one of his original sketchbooks, and on the right is one of the tags that he was using from the system. So it's not perfect, but you can start to see that he's getting the ability to draw back. And that was sort of phase one of that project. Now we're into the second phase, which is there's not a whole lot of people with ALS that write graffiti, and so we're trying to now open this up so that it can be a system that's used we have an on-screen keyboard, so it can be used to type emails and browse the web. The new system no longer has the head-mounted unit. It just sits on your laptop. It can account for motion with the head movement so the calibration doesn't get off. This isn't officially released yet, but if you look on Unstructables, you can find the how-to guide, and if you look on GitHub, you can find the software and the source code. And there's obviously a lot of stories in this project that are as big as the technology. Tempt has this big narrative, but another story that doesn't get talked about as much is there's a really interesting open source narrative in this project as well, which is that the team of 6 of us made this. None of us had an engineering professional background. None of us had a professional programming background. We all came from the arts. We made this project in part-time. We made this in essentially 2 10-day trips to Los Angeles, and we were able to come up with a project that is part of like Time's 50 whatever innovations of the year. And we did this coming from an arts background and working in an open source development model. And so for me, that has like a lot of weight and excites me thinking about what's possible with open source. At the same time I was working on the graffiti analysis project with that team, I was also working on, at the same time I was working with iWriter, I was also working on a project that I started in graduate school called Graffiti Analysis and getting reinvested in this project which is designed, it's also software for graffiti writers. This is open source software that can track a light source and record graffiti motion data and save it digitally. So it was meant to sort of archive and be a data visualization of graffiti tags. And so it represents time in the 3rd dimension. The thickness of the line is represented based on how fast the writer was moving. So the thinner the line, the faster the pen was moving. And originally this was designed to be a projection piece, like a public space piece. The idea being that people, I'm lucky enough that I get to hang out with graffiti writers and see graffiti written, and part of the beauty of graffiti is that it's this gestural sort of dance, but people outside of the scene never get to witness that. You just kind of see the ink on the wall the next morning. And so this piece originally was about showing people that motion and projecting that motion in the city. And so there's a lot of features in the new version designed for projecting in public space. The new version has sort of architectural awareness so that you can identify different elements that you're projecting on. It also has the ability to take that motion data and transfer it into a 3D model that then can be exported as a .stl file, which projects like the MakerBot and other 3D rapid prototyping devices can load in, so that you can take this motion data and 3D print it into a physical sculpture. But even though it has all this functionality, people tend to think about this as a projection piece still. And in the beginning it was, but lately I've been less interested in it being a public performance piece and more interested in it being a data collection piece. And so now, as I'm traveling around and and doing exhibitions in different cities, instead of just showing the same project, I'm now using that as an opportunity to meet with graffiti writers and collect this data. And the biggest new feature is really one that's not as visible, but is the most exciting to me, which is that now the data is being saved in a standard file format. And so iWriter's writing to this format, Graffiti Analysis is writing to this format, and now it's meant to save it into a format that's very easy to read, so that hobbyist programmers can open this up and see what's going on and take part in this project. It's called Graffiti Markup Language, so now, just like you have a .jpeg or a .doc file, now you have a .gml file. And it's meant to be this bridge between my two favorite groups of makers nowadays, which are computer hackers and graffiti writers, and sort of be a place for them to sort of start collaborating. And so now all these projects are writing into GML. I'll quickly show some of the community development that's happened with GML just in the last few months. Some of these projects are coming from me and friends of mine, and some of these are coming from anonymous collaborators on the web.
I said yeah, I said yeah, what they say, what they say. Don't you hear? I say yeah, this is what they say, what they say. Do you believe I would take something with me and give it to the policeman? I wouldn't do that. And if I do that, I would say, sir, I want to put the charge on me. I wouldn't do that. No, I wouldn't do that. I'm not a fool to hurt myself, so I was innocent of what they done to me. They was wrong. Listen to me one more time. They were wrong. Oh yeah, give it to me 1 time. Give it to me 2 times. Give it to me 3 times. Yeah. Give it to me 4 times. 446 was my number. Right now, someone has that number. One more time.
So things like open source software is already hard enough to make look sexy and fun. It is to me, but not to everybody. But open data structures and open data formats and online open data systems are even harder to make look kind of fun to the kids. So GML is supposed to be that, hopefully. It's supposed to be a way to make something that's inherently boring seem a bit fun. And just to show one last example, and then we can go to lunch. This is, so the iWriter writes to this, right? And just to show how the iWriter is a high barrier to entry project as an open source project, right? It's something you have to have C++ knowledge of, eye tracking knowledge of. But since the data it saves to is so simple, it allows things to happen like me making ridiculous tweets. This is a tweet I made where I said, this is what I asked Santa for maybe next year. Just a Photoshop collage of a giant robotic arm with a graffiti marker, right? Forgetting that very smart people are following my Twitter account, like Golan Levin, who teaches at Carnegie Mellon. Within 2 weeks, Golan sent me back this video, which is taking a GML tag from Temp that Temp drew with the iWriter, and made a patch so that he could load in GML files to this robotic arm system that was sitting around Carnegie Mellon. And so while this is maybe a ridiculous example of technology, it's a very interesting story for me, and I know it was exciting for Temp to see his name actually written in ink based on movement that he made with his eye. And so this is like one of those times when the unexpected outcomes that happen from these open collaborative models can just be amazing. And so I love graffiti, and a lot of the work I'm doing is because I love graffiti, but I'm also sort of using graffiti in a way as this foothold into general, more popular culture that I'm hopefully bringing all this free culture, open source stuff along with me. And that's true about the other work that I'm doing, whether that's my solo work or to work with Graffiti Research Lab or FAT. And it's about spreading these free culture ideals into the more general popular culture circuits. And so with that, I think we can go to lunch. If you want to find me, you can do an I'm Feeling Lucky Google search for Badass Motherfucker, or you can email me at the email address listed here. Thank you.
Wow. There you go. I think that kind of epitomizes disruption. And we can't open up to questions at the moment, but you can contact Ivan over lunch. You'll be around over lunch for questions and on Twitter and so on. But there is just something I would like to say, because we have, for the past sort of 100 years or so, lived in a culture of obey. This is what we teach our kids to do in our schools. They're cultural reproduction systems. They have very little to do with learning. What you're talking about now is actually saying disobey. So we have all these technologies that can be hacked, game hacking, toy hacking, that kind of thing. I mean, how do we take these kinds of ideas and imbue them into, say, schooling systems for primary children?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this watching some of the other speakers too, because I was thinking, like, I didn't learn programming from the classroom. Like, I didn't learn it from like an app, right? I learned it because people like Joshua Davis in the early sort of Flash days were releasing source code files. And so, like, I was having the thought that I hope the classroom doesn't get the iPad. Like, I hope they get a real computer that they can download and install their own software, write code, compile their own code. Like, I hope that things merge towards people getting used to computers being something that they control. And if that gets into the classroom, I think that the computing systems can be thought of as creation devices instead of just consuming devices. So I think that's part of the open source culture too, is that we treat these things like they're ours and we can control what happens on them. And I know that that's how I learned programming. Like, I don't think I would have learned it otherwise.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Ivan. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.